Thank you very much. Can everyone hear us? All good at the back? I'm going to do a very brief introduction for these guys, and I'm just going to keep it brief because I'm going to then let them speak to themselves because they're much more able than I am. But very briefly, this is Richard from Kite Magnetics, and I will get him to introduce that company and what he does. Next to me here is Alex from HAMR Energy. And again, I'll get Alex to introduce himself as well. And sitting on the end is Ruchika from C4Net. So that's just who you know, who you're talking to. Look, we are going to be pretty fluid. I can keep on talking till the cows come home, and I'll keep on asking these guys questions. I'm going to get us going with a few easy ones, getting them to talk about themselves and introducing their companies to you and what they do. Anytime you've got a question after that, start sticking your hand up, and we can go open mic as early as we want. But like I said, this is going to be a conversation. It shouldn't just be the four of us talking. It should be some of you as well. And that will make it more enjoyable, not only for you, but for us. So, but firstly, a thank you to you for also coming tonight. It's a bit wet and windy and miserable outside, so it's quite good to be in here. But thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy this evening. But firstly, I'm going to go over to Richard, and the first question, this is a bit startup-y, but just give us the 1-minute introduction to yourself and Kite Magnetics, Richard.
Sure, my pleasure. Hi, everyone. My name's Dr. Richard Parsons. I'm the founder and CEO of Kite Magnetics. Kite Magnetics is a venture-backed aerospace manufacturing company located right here in Melbourne. We specialize in producing very high-performance electric motors, specifically for electric aircraft. Kite Magnetics is a company that's currently 9 people. We're quite young, so we were founded only around 8 months ago now. But we've already developed a first product, which is a 120 kilowatt direct drive electric motor for electric aircraft. Myself, I'm an engineer, and I worked as an academic at Monash University for about 10 years.
Thank you very much. Alex, same question.
Thanks, Richard. Afternoon or evening, everybody. So I'm Alex Smith. I'm a co-founder of HAMR Energy. So we are a company that is looking to make green fuels, specifically green methanol, to decarbonise the shipping industry. We started about 2 years ago. I am a chemical engineer out of the oil and gas industry. Worked as an engineer and mainly in the project space. We are 3 with an advisory board at the moment. And I guess our key thing is around decarbonising the shipping industry and giving some solutions to decarbonising the hard-to-abate sectors.
So well done, Alex. You've grown by 50% since our last discussion, with now going out to 3 rather than 2. So that startups move very quickly. Ruchika, tell us about C4Net.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ruchika Deora. I'm the program director at the Centre for New Energy Technologies. We're a nonprofit that was started by the Victorian government to facilitate research and the integration of new energy into the existing grid infrastructure for electricity. We do a lot of work with universities, with incumbents in the energy sector, and with startups to help them access data that they might be able to leverage into their product development.
Thank you. So what we've got here, and I found it quite interesting to even put this panel together. I think what Ruchika does at the end with C4Net, I call them the really intelligent glue that helps pull together what academia might be doing, what government might be looking to do, and big industry, and somehow C4Net get right in the middle of that and make some decent-sized projects happen. So I find that fascinating. Alex is looking at kind of fuels in various different ways, whether that's hydrogen or green methanol. So again, in some of those harder to abate sectors, and Richard's coming at it from a totally different angle and looking at one of those hardest, arguably, to abate sectors, the aviation industry, and making that possible through electrical motors, which is a very different angle than I've seen before, so quite exciting. But I'm going to have my first question over here, because I think there's a bit of shared background between you two guys and where the companies that you used to work for. So you're now on the good side of engineering, but you both used to work for big fossil fuel companies. So can you both take us through, maybe one at a time, of how you ended up in those companies, and then what triggered the change from the dark side over to this side?
So what Richard is referring to is I'm not an engineer, and my background, I was a political science and religion undergrad major. I thought I wanted to go into law, and that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. You can tell from the accent, I'm from the United States. And at the time I was considering going to law school, there were actually more students in law school than there were practicing lawyers in the United States. It was like this that was the career du jour for everyone. I ended up taking a break, traveling around and deciding to get my MBA from a second tier school in the US. And I got recruited to work for ExxonMobil out of there. And not only did I work for ExxonMobil, I worked in their downstream, which is where they were not only selling fuel in terms of petrol, but they were also selling tobacco and fast food and things like that. And I was responsible for coming up with new business models to help improve those sales. So I had a lot to atone for when I decided that that was not the career for me. And I met my now husband. We moved to Australia, and I knew I wanted to get into renewable energy in some way, shape, or form. And I again, was fortunate enough to fall into a company called Enernoc, which is now Enel X, which is a big Italian utility that does a lot in the green space. And there's something really interesting in electricity called demand management, where if you're in the energy space and you're supplying generation to the electricity network, you're really working in a real-time scenario because it's very difficult to store electricity. And one of the things that Enernoc and now Enel X do is they pay large energy users to use less electricity instead of having to pull on really dirty coal or gas-fired power plants. So it's a peak demand management. So when the grid is really operating at peak demand, I fell in love with the sector. I am incredibly fortunate to love what I do every single day. And it really resonated with me to have a diversified grid that actually looks at not just burning something or managing generation to have an environmental impact. And then I've spent a lot of my career, it's just a portfolio career. I'm trying to understand as much as I can about the sector and trying to have as many experiences so that I can see behind the curtain and figure out what we need to do in order to drive and affect change. And in the midst of all my sort of big career moves, I've taken several breaks. I've worked for nonprofits. I've worked as startup consultants, and I'm tinkering away on my own entrepreneurial journey slowly but surely as well. So yeah, I'm having a blast not having like a career path, if you will.
Alex, talk to me about that dark side that you've got.
So my education background is chemical engineering with arts, with politics and Arabic from Melbourne. I started as a graduate with ESO. At the time, that was kind of the pick of the grad jobs as an engineer, sort of 22 years ago now. I did that for a while and then ended up moving around a bit. I worked as an engineer for Worley, Australian engineering company in the UK. Came back to ESO, and mainly over that time I have worked in project development, so got a bit of a passion for building stuff, basically. The startup journey kind of began about 2 years ago, so I use the term very advisedly, but for me it was a mid-career kind of pivot. It was either stay doing the same thing or move. So made the decision to move in the middle of COVID, a whole bunch of other stuff going on. So the other founder of HAMR and myself spent a bit of time looking. We sort of had some ideas, but not we just knew we wanted to do something else. So we started looking, blank piece of paper, we started looking at hydrogen, and we slowly developed the opportunity, I guess, to manufacture green methanol. So not many people have heard of green methanol. I'm sure that not many hands would go up if I asked people if they knew what it was. That's not surprising. We don't produce any methanol in Australia, and we don't really even refuel ships in Australia, so I don't expect people to know too much about the mix between green methanol and the shipping industry. But where we kind of went was, and I think there's some themes here, is we tried to work out how to best use the skill set that we had. So it was the knowledge in engineering and building big stuff, understanding sort of the chemicals industry, safety and plant design, that kind of thing. So what we're trying to do is not that far removed from our whole career, I guess. But what is different is obviously working in a very small organisation without the help, I guess, and having to kind of self-start and work out exactly what you're going to do. So that has its pros and cons. The money side is obviously also has its issues as well. Yeah, so I guess a bit of a journey for HAMR. So we have done a seed funding round. And we're currently fundraising. What they say about startups is true. You're always fundraising. So we're fundraising again in a project down in Portland, which is looking to take residual forestry biomass and convert that into green methanol for a shipping fuel to displace fossil fuels effectively.
So I think the lesson there, and I was intrigued when I saw the background of both of these guys, because I think it's quite easy when we come through the energy transition to point at big energy and point at big oil and gas and claim them as being the dark side and evil. But we all use fossil fuels. We still do. About 70% of our lighting right now is coming from fossil fuels, and we all go to Esso and Caltex and Shell and fill up every day. So we're the consumers that have been driving that behavior. But interestingly now, we've got two people on the panel that have used that background and the experience they've gained through those companies to now be part of the energy transition. So I found that a bit of a fascinating background. But Richard, you've taken a very different path of getting your doctorate, coming through the university system, and basically commercializing your own innovation, your own research. So can you talk about that to everyone for a few minutes on how that came about?
So I studied at Monash University. I was there for far too many years. I started in 2008, went through as an undergrad, honours year as a science, then did a PhD for 3 years and a postdoc. And in 2018, just as I finished my postdoc and was working as a lecturer and a researcher, we developed a new magnetic material called aeroperm. And aeroperm looks physically a bit like kitchen foil. It's a thin, metallic, shiny foil, about 20 microns thick, about the thickness of a white blood cell. And what's unique about this magnetic material is that when used in electric motors, you can make them significantly more efficient and lighter. And so we had this fantastic new technology that we developed, the process of making this and the composition itself. And so for me at that point, it was a decision of, well, do I stay in academia and go down the path of becoming a professor and a full-time lecturer, chasing grants and all that comes with that? Or do we take this really potentially valuable technology, when I say valuable, I mean in terms of impact it could have on society and the climate and everything else, and try and push this out into be commercialized as quickly as possible. So the typical timeline from new technology development in the lab to large-scale commercial adoption by all of us is about 20 years. And the thought of letting this new technology sit on the shelf for the next 19 years until it's ready to be picked up wasn't really sitting well with me. So I went down a very aggressive journey of trying to pivot from being an academic in a lab, literally wearing the white lab coat every day and lecturing, to then getting heavily involved in the startup scene. And so if anyone here is studying or is a lecturer, researcher or anything like that, you can make that transition if you go and do what we all do, I think, which is read all the books and watch all the videos and most importantly, talk to as many people as you can in that startup space. So for me, 2018 developed the technology, 2020 we had got to a point where we were confident the technology could be adapted to electric motors. 2022, I formally resigned. We raised 1.85 million to start Kite Magnetics. And since then, in the last 7 months, we've scaled from just myself to now a team of 9 engineers and our first product. So a pretty rapid journey in all seems.
Yeah, and look, a fantastic effort. I think we'll come back to this point later on. Richard's one of the, got some financial backing through Breakthrough Victoria, which a lot of startups have tried to do, but very few have actually managed to succeed in. So I'll maybe put you on notice for that one. I think there's some secret sauce in there that you're not going to want to tell anyone about. But I'm going to go back over here because we touched on this theme of industry, right? So Ruchika, you'll probably know more of the stats than I do, but the scale of the energy transition that we're looking at in general is just vast. Depends on who you talk to, we're saying this is going to be a 20 or 30 year journey. the resources that are required in terms of financial resources, research, and support are enormous. And it's some of those very companies that may have been actually, part of the fossil fuel industry that are going to be pivotal going forwards. And I know, Ruchika, you're working with government right now, but that industry angle, how important is that going to be going forwards?
I think for like a lot of sectors, right, the innovation happens, I think, external to some of those large industrial organizations. And when you want to scale, that's kind of how you go, right? You need to leverage their existing channels, whether that's distribution or consumer, market share, whatever it is. They're going to be the ones that help really get the product and the solutions out there at scale. For us, where I particularly sit in the electricity sector, that's distribution networks. That's the part of the electricity grid that literally carries electricity from a higher voltage to your home or your business. And that's where so much of the transition is occurring. If you think about rooftop solar, if you think about when you purchase an electric vehicle, that's going to eventually be a mobile battery for your house or for your business at a fleet level. The electrification of public transportation, all of that is happening at the low voltage level. And the distribution networks are pivotal in driving how quickly that happens, how much value is unlocked for consumers and other stakeholders that are participating in new markets. The other sort of incumbent, as I call them, in this space will be government and regulators, because they're the ones that help create the markets, help ensure that if there are vulnerable groups, that those are being protected. So they're critically important. I think it can be easy, as you mentioned, to sort of say, big bad corporations are big and bad, but they started out small as well, and they've learned a lot of lessons, and what you can do to leverage their experience and their channels is important. Yeah.
Now, Alex, I know without naming any of the organizations, you are talking and seeking investment from some of those big firms, because you are looking at, and I think if anyone here doesn't know, it's one of the hardest to abate sectors. And I think, shipping fuel is responsible for however many percent
I can do the fun facts. So 97% of all goods come in on ships into Australia and leave. So it's in the supply chain, and 97% of what we have. Globally, 300 million tonnes a year of fossil fuels used in the shipping industry. And if shipping was a country, it would be twice the emissions of Australia. So just to put it in perspective in terms of that's just shipping is.
So in order to do this, and whether it's hydrogen or green methanol, they're not cheap to put those production plants together. I think even to put a demonstration or a test facility together is at least 5 million. And that's probably just the start point. So how are you approaching those investors, right? Because these are the big companies and you do have that experience. So how's that journey going?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. And I think in the startup space, where we have angled ourselves is to, and I kind of said it before, but to build on the experience that we've got after 20 years of working in the industry. So we're not trying to reinvent ourselves to go and do something that we don't know about. So, and for us, that was really important because we kind of sense that it's like people that have the skill set out of big business that have the desire or the willingness to go and do a startup, which is nimble and can actually go and try and do things differently is really important. So when we talk to big business, it's really bringing that background to the fore. You get the credibility after a career. Actually, people know what your background is. So people know that if you've worked for ExxonMobil in a particular role, they kind of know the kinds of stuff that you've done and know that you're not afraid of lots of zeros on numbers and that kind of thing, which actually helps a lot when you're trying to extract money from people, because people want to know that you're going to look after and actually be able to do what you say you're going to do. And that's one of the things that we find helps us a lot. And I think for startups looking for money, one of the key things people look at is, well, how do I know you're actually going to do what you say you're going to do? And I think that's where we've observed it over time. Like you've got, lot of experience there, and like a lot of experience with you, Ruchika, about getting through those early phases and really building a solid foundation and like a profession in terms of what you actually bring to the table in the startup space. And we've seen, you're probably the same, but we've seen a lot of startups now come through. And one of the things we now get really attuned to is how likely are that the founders really going to be to follow through and be able to do what they say they're going to do. And there's a big correlation between the startups that are a continuation of what people have done as their career. We're seeing that they are becoming quite successful. People that have tried to go and do the pivot and do something completely different, it's a lot harder work. It's not saying it's not possible, but it does take a lot more effort. So I guess to answer your question, we find that because we've got the experience in big industry, we can talk the language of big industry, and that helps a lot. Yeah.
Talking the language of big industry, I think you've got a very interesting view on the aviation industry, which are dominated by a couple of very big global players. How do you think they're viewing what you're doing? Because if it works and you are successful, that's a game changer in the aviation industry.
Yeah, for sure. So in our space, the incumbents, the competitors, you could say, are the gas turbine manufacturers. So it's GE, it's Rolls-Royce, it's Pratt & Whitney. It's these massive, multi-billion-dollar, multi-thousand-person conglomerates. And they've got the typical innovator's dilemma. They're building gas turbines, which they've been building for, in some cases, nearly 100 years now. And they're building it for their customers, which is Airbus, it's Embraer, it's Boeing, these equally large multinationals. Us, we're a speck of dust. We're not even on their radar. So they don't think about us at all at this stage. They're thinking about what they need for their customers, which is bigger, better, more efficient gas turbines for the next 30 years. And so, as is always the case, they won't pay this market, our space, the electric propulsion space for electric aircraft, and that's for battery electric and fuel cell electric, really much attention. They won't give it much resources, right up to the point that someone like us is already very far along and maybe a little bit too late to catch up. So I think that's true for a lot of industries. The biggest advantage we have is speed. The biggest advantage we have is that to make a decision requires, in my case as a sole founder, one person's say yes. While if you're a big organisation, you've got to get 30 people from the lowest ranks to the highest highs all to get on board, say yes, and then even then it's a very slow ship to turn.
Looking ahead, you've got your current incumbents, your GEs, your Mitsubishis, whoever is producing those turbines. Do you think you might have more interest in the future coming from the battery manufacturers, the Hyundais, the Teslas of this world? Do you think they could be future investors for you rather than the turbine manufacturers?
So we are also talking to the turbine manufacturers. They like to keep their finger on the pulse and know what's happening in this space, as you can imagine. The battery manufacturers, they're not really paying much attention to the aviation industry. For them, the EV industry is so enormous compared to what's in battery electric aircraft today. It is so small. And that's actually a real challenge for companies trying to make electric aircraft. They can't get access to the cells because the Teslas of the world, the Lucids, the whoever, are just sucking up all the cells. And so it makes it really challenging to try and build these demonstration aircraft and show that the technology works at this stage. Maybe in future. Yeah.
So maybe going to come back to Ruchika, right? Because again, it's such an enormous problem for Australia and globally. I think in many of these sectors, the role of government has to be pivotal. Now, whether that's federal government or whether it's local state government, that can literally make or break industries. So can you give us you're dealing quite a lot directly with various government departments, be that federal and local. Can you take us through what you think the role of government is, and particularly government looking at the energy transition and maybe that interaction with startups as well?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because when, as a constituent, we're all just citizens. We watch the news. We have our own, lives going on, and we want to make change, and we recognize, we're in a massive climate crisis, right? Like they just announced today that they think that the Arctic Sea is not going to refreeze over the summer, and we've reached a pivotal point in global warming or the climate change. so we all want to do something, and or most of us do, and there's tremendous amount of opportunity, and the challenge becomes at what scale is the opportunity most efficient for the kind of change that we need to see when it comes to climate change. So what I mean by that is an example is batteries and what we call community batteries, neighborhood batteries. The government in Victoria does a lot to incentivize homeowners to put batteries actually on their homes. Is that the most efficient way to get storage out into Victoria at scale? Maybe, maybe not. But what they're actually doing is they're driving down the cost of manufacturing those batteries. So the way that the government is investing in supporting that industry is that they're trying to create economies of scale for early stage technologies that are trying to commercialize. And I think that's exactly where the government needs to be playing, right? Because that's very difficult for other organizations or investors to do, to take that risk and say, actually, we're going to back a technology that we think has massive impact for affecting climate change, getting more renewables on the grid, allowing people to actually leverage solar on their roof or solar in their communities. The other thing that I think, again, and we were talking about this prior to the panel, is that they're really starting to. I've heard more conversation in the past 3 years than I have in my previous 20 career-wise of governments trying to figure out how to support early stage startups, whether that's, Launch Vic or Startup Victoria. There's so many accelerators now. There's a lot going on, and a lot of them are actually government backed or the government's really getting involved there. And again, that's the role that government should play, because if hypothetically Exxon made a decision to do something, that's a commercial decision. They're making that based on commercial variables. They have shareholders that they have to respond to. They have certain business model and revenue criteria. The government has a much broader remit that they can, open up for early stage startups. So I think they're incredibly critical. That we haven't seen that as much at the federal level, I think, for a variety of reasons. I won't get into the nuance of politics and the party reasons, but just in the past 6 months to a year, we are also seeing a massive pivot at a federal level around targeted climate objectives, where those climate objectives then need additional support, whether that's through existing industry or startups. So we are seeing that change. If you are at all interested in this space, in terms of energy startups, energy tech startups, it is an incredibly exciting time to be in this space. And there is, I think, a lot of support out there for you in different ways. But like all entrepreneurs, these guys will be able to tell you even more. There's a hustle involved in it that is unrelenting. So
hustle in government, Alex. I know you were a recipient last year of a smallish grant from DELP, which is now DECA, and then you had a run-in with the federal government as well that wasn't quite so good. So what's your view? Or maybe you can give everyone here a bit of that background that I know and give me your current view.
Sure. So the company line is very much we love government. We're conscious that you get a grant and you're actually spending taxpayer dollars, and we often have a bit of a talk about that. So we do want to make sure that we actually deliver something tangible for that money. Richard did say it, so we have had good support from government. So I think I'd say the same thing, that as of May last year, there's been quite significant change in the outlook on where, I guess, climate policy and action is going. And I think there's been some very tangible changes in the things that government are looking at supporting. I take, for example, that I'll give you an example maybe to illustrate. So we've been looking at green methanol, which is basically leading the decarbonisation of shipping as an alternate shipping fuel. We've been looking at it now for about 2 years. When we started talking to government, it was very clear that they'd never heard of methanol, had never really talked about decarbonisation of shipping. You can go back and look at the Port of Melbourne decarbonisation plan done 2 or 3 years ago. It doesn't actually mention anything about alternate fuel. Only it talks about is sort of decarbonising the trucking or the at port electrification. So it's really changed a lot in the last I guess, 6 months, to the point where the other founder at the moment's in Singapore, looking to do some engagement there with the port the port industry in Singapore, just around sort of green fuels and the like. And I think maybe one of the challenges with government, I think, is actually getting companies to stick to Australia. So I think that's another big factor that it's not so much for us, given that we're trying to build a facility in Australia, but particularly, and you probably see it a lot, Richard, but there's a lot of pull for companies to move overseas. So I think there's always more that can be done in the Australian context to support startups. Not we're never going to be super happy, but I will say that there is grant money out there. There is a very supportive startup space, and we've been the recipients of that as well, out of, I guess, indirectly out of LaunchVic as well. And government is just a long road getting grants. It's you earn the right to spend the taxpayer dollar. It's a big deal to get government money. So
Richard, you came through a different angle. So the university system is, I suppose, indirectly supported by government and sometimes directly. But then you've now had the experience of working with and being in, have Breakthrough Victoria invest in your company, which is government taxpayer money. So can you give us your view on the role of government, and then particularly what that journey was like and the discussion with Breakthrough Victoria?
So, in my opinion, yes, government's a fantastic enabler. They're not going to be the ones that fund you all the way through. They have to open the door and make it possible. So for context, we took a license for a technology that I helped develop in the lab, and we've taken that license from Monash, and so Kite holds the exclusive right to develop that technology. That process wasn't smooth, I guess you could say. It was quite an undertaking for about a year there to negotiate that agreement. There has been work recently to make that smoother, which is nice, but I think we've got some way to go still before there's an easy path for academics to get out of the lab and into a startup. When it comes to Breakthrough Victoria, so if you're not aware, that's the Victorian government's relatively new $2 billion fund. It's a for-profit VC, so it's like all the other VCs, but the dollars come from the taxpayer. I was quite fortunate. I got in early with them when they were still a team of less than 20. They're now probably more than 60 people. For me, it was a process of submitting the form online like everyone does, and then I heard nothing for 6 weeks because they were just swamped. I started calling, and eventually I got a call back and I said, hey, look, this round's coming together. We are exactly your remit. We need to have a call. We need to have a discussion, and then it sort of propagated from there. Coming from a university, having that academic background definitely helped. I think, like all VCs, it really helps to do your homework. Know not just the VC itself and what their mandate is and how they think and how they make decisions, but also be really aware of just the venture-backed model in general, and learn to speak the lingo and the language of how they go through that elimination process in their mind in the first 30 seconds they meet you. Are you going to stick with this? Is it venture backable? Is it something that they can convince their bosses to actually invest in? Because they're not always the ones making the decision, the person you're talking to. The more you can think and understand that, the easier your fundraising journey will be. And trust me, I know, because the first pitches I did to investors, they weren't great. It was me with a recent conference proceeding talking to the deep physics of nanotechnology to a VC, and no good. But through learning and seeing other people's pitches, you get better.
And maybe just an extension question, because look, again, I would encourage everyone out here to get out there a little bit and have a look and see what's around. I went out to a Deakin battery manufacturing facility or test facility that again was recipient, I think, of about somewhere between 11 and $12 million worth of government money. It was a real eye-opener, because I keep on hearing these news articles, and particularly miners saying that we can't manufacture here in Australia. That was a real eye-opener for me, of saying, well, I think in specific industries we probably can. You know a lot about your specific area, which is very much linked into the battery industry. Do you have a view of if you keep going on the journey you're going, will you try and manufacture in Australia? Is that cost prohibitive? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, so I've been very vocal and public about saying I want this to be an Australian success and definitely a Victorian success, and that doesn't hurt when you're talking to government entities like Breakthrough Vic. Here in Australia, we have world-class engineers, the best of the best that you're going to find anywhere in the world, and I can say that quite honestly. We've got fantastic facilities, great government research, universities, the whole lot. What we do lack is the size of the talent pool. We're a 26 million person nation, whatever we are now, and there can be more people in one city in Japan, or more economic activity in a single neighborhood in New York. It's small from that scale. And so when we talk to investors, local and international, we're already getting that pool saying, well, when are you going to move to the US, and when are you going to come to Europe? And we say, look, we will have operations there. We have to. We're an international company. But for us, we want the heart, the soul, the headquarters, the R&D, and for as long as possible, the production to be done here. Having said that, we can do that because we are a very high-tech manufacturing. We're not making toasters and bedpans, we're making high-performance propulsion solutions for electric aircraft. And so if you're pitching the idea of doing something that's very labour-intensive and polluting, then yeah, you're going to have a hard time doing it here. But if you're proposing doing something that's very knowledge-driven, high-tech, then it can be done, I believe, and I hope.
Alex, we're talking about hydrogen, or I'm shifting to hydrogen now. For those of you that don't know, in the US, the Biden administration, about 6 months ago, introduced quite a sweeping policy shift called the IRA, which basically is offering up billions of dollars in subsidies and grants, particularly around hydrogen. Now, there's been a real kind of knowledge suck, and if not, even I've heard plants that were proposed for Australia not being built anymore and shifted over to the US. We've had a small reaction from the federal government of putting, I think, $2 billion up for grabs, but that's a fraction of the US. What are your thoughts on that?
So, yeah, it's an interesting space. So the Inflation Reduction Act definitely had a big impact in the hydrogen industry, and I guess the alternate fuels industry in general. I think there has been a response by the Australian government, and it's still under development. Where we are in the sort of project development timeline, we are sort of choosing to not ignore, but our go-forward plan is that there will need to be some kind of support to match or to at least alleviate some of the issues caused by the Inflation Reduction Act, and that whether that's a hydrogen subsidy or grants or something like that'll come through. Australia's not the only country that's been impacted by it. Canada was instantly impacted. Everyone just drove across the border. And I think Europe's had the same thing, and they've responded in other ways. India's in the same space and talking about the same thing. So I think to us, it's a bit of a watching brief at the moment on what actually transpires there. But I think that the market piece is interesting as well. And we get that in spades, is Australia is quite a small market. So having an overarching policy, for Australia to have an overarching policy, it might not necessarily be the right answer. It might be a case-by-case basis, might be the better way to deal with some of the sort of issues, I guess, and look at specific plans and specific projects that are taken forward and see how best to support those.
Chica, I'm going to come to you because I read an article. This one was even yesterday. This is how fast this space moves. In EV land, California has just put forward draft legislation of saying by 2027, any EV that's in market and sold in market plus any charger of an EV must be bidirectional. Now, it's just draft legislation right now. For those of you that don't know, bidirectional charging means that you can basically use the battery in your electric vehicle to either power your house, that's vehicle to home, or input into the grid, which is vehicle to grid. So potentially, if that legislation gets up in California, and I'd be surprised if it didn't because they set the emission standards years ago in the US, by creating that legislation, they're setting the standard. particularly for the US, that will probably transfer globally. So does Australia go far enough in some of its policy when we see things like the Inflation Reduction Act in...
No.
No.
Short answer is no. I mean, I didn't know this until last year when the government, I mean, again, switch in government, right? Massive pivot. But one of the first things that this current federal government administration did was put out a call for consultation on an EV roadmap for the nation. And as part of that EV roadmap, I didn't realize that we don't have fuel emission standards, which is
Us and Russia.
insane. And I think Saudi, and that was it. It was us, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, and probably North Korea. But like, that's where then all of the dirty cars go. Like, this is what's driving the fact that we don't have enough EVs in Australia to meet demand. We personally purchased an EV in February of last year and took delivery of it in December. That's an insane wait. Actually, I mentioned to my husband, I was like, we should buy two and just immediately resell one because we could make money off of that. But like, short answer is no. They're trying to shift that. And I think that, best intentions, but we need to do more. It's just picking up on what Alex was saying. I'm worried about a brain drain, to be honest with you, in some of these areas. We have an insane CSIRO, our academic researchers in the development in this space for some of the new technologies is amazing. Not only in energy, also in medical research, but energy as well. And I am very worried that despite having some of the most livable cities in the world, we're going to have people go overseas because they can get access to capital and expansion and, quote unquote, bigger markets. I mean, I think, Richard, your goal is admirable, and I would hope other people would take that as a potential model, right? There's no reason why you can't be based in Australia and have your heart here and have operations, in other parts of the world to leverage those local markets. I think the government is trying to figure that out a little bit. I mean, you and I have been on panels where they've asked, what do we need to do? How can we improve this? But they haven't quite gotten there yet. And I think that, again, this is why this is an exciting space. I think they are very, very keen to try to address these challenges. So I would say watch the space.
Alex, your view?
No, I completely agree. I think I laugh always at the fuel standards one. Again, looking at alternate fuels, if there was a fuels emission standard or some kind of even just target for, be careful there, some states do have targets, but a national standard for fuels would help and would potentially be an easy way to create a market for alternative fuels, because it all comes down to the market. So who's willing to pay? And that's one of the areas where if government, where we often advocate is if government just said that they were going to buy X percent of green fuel, that would underpin a project to go and make that fuel. That's potentially a different way and potentially a lot better than giving money up front to the project to support CapEx, because it's all around the market. All these projects in investment is all underpinned, or in alternate fuels, is all around the market. Well, I guess even yours is all around the market. Who's going to buy the product? And that's where the focus needs to be. And I think the hydrogen, talk about hydrogen for a bit, very topical. So I think we started looking in the hydrogen space. Again, it's all about market. There's not a lot of hydrogen being exported today, and there probably won't be for a number of years. There's not a lot of hydrogen being used. So we keep going back to it's all about the market. And that's where our process, I haven't talked much about what we're trying to do, but the innovation that we're looking at is using hydrogen at scale as part of the feedstock into alternate fuel. So effectively using methanol as a hydrogen vector. And what that does is it creates this use for hydrogen, and that's where we feel that the focus can be to build the hydrogen industry. It's not going to be in trucks and cars, is kind of where we sense. So slight tangent there, but yeah.
The brain drain, Richard, Ruchika mentioned that. You've come out of those academic circles, and I'm sure you've seen some of that. Do you think that's a threat to the academic system here and people following in your footsteps?
I'm not as concerned about it as you might think. Maybe 5 years ago, but I feel like today, you mentioned we have these fantastic livable cities. If only we could solve the housing affordability issue, it would be so easy for us to attract talent from Canada, from the US, from across Europe. Come live in Melbourne, come live in Sydney. People are clamoring to do that. In terms of academics, I mean, the universities I've worked at, they've been very good at pulling in internationally recognised academics from around the world as well. So what the challenge I do see, a little bit aside from the brain drain topic, is the scaling journey. I've seen startups here when they've gone from 30 people to 150 in a few years, and they'll tap out the entire nation's worth of specialists in one domain. So at that point, you have to bring in people. And so easier visa applications for specialist talent is required. But really, it's the housing issue. If people can't afford to live here, they're not going to move here. But that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, good. Have you seen, I mean, still fairly early on your expansion right now, have you had discussions with any VCs or investing entities that have been hinting that if you relocated, it might be easier?
Yes, 100%. Especially when you're talking to international US investors, a rough rule of thumb, the cost of capital in the US and the Valley might be half of what it is here, especially as you get to later rounds. And there's been plenty of examples of local great startups that have done great rounds, been very capitally conservative, but then their European US counterparts have just outraised them 3-1 and outspent them 3-1. And even if the tech here is better, you can fix a lot of problems with just be pouring money onto them. And so at some point, well, right now with our next fundraise, we will be looking to that international VCs. It would be crazy not to.
So I'm just going to give everyone a couple of minutes notice. I am going to be starting to look at the audience. So start lining your questions up because I'm getting tired of my own voice. And I really want to hear from the audience and see where you're going. So maybe just a final little round of questions from me. I think we are quite fortunate here in Australia in general, particularly in Victoria, in that I think we've really grown the startup industry over the last 10 years or so. I've run a couple of startups myself. I was just spending my own money. I didn't realize I was bootstrapping. No one told me that. I was just running my own companies with almost no support. You would lucky if you find a mate at a pub that you could talk something through with. But that ecosystem has been very much built over the last 10 years, and particularly in the last 5 years, with Launch Vic and Startup Vic and various other entities. Even this facility we're in right now is still relatively new, but is now forming part of that startup ecosystem. So maybe I'll go the other way first. Your thoughts on the startup ecosystem and where you think it may have helped you or what you've managed to gain from it, Richard?
I've been through far too many accelerator programs, I can say, but they've all been very useful in terms of making connections. I think you're right. I mean, I've only been in this system for 2 or 3 years now, so I don't know what it was before that. But my experience in this time has been that everyone in this space, they know how hard it is. If you're talking to other people who are running their own companies or are working for startups, they know how tough it is. And so I've been amazed at how generous everyone is, from the lowest levels to the highest CEOs in the biggest companies. They've all been really keen to have a conversation, and those conversations are super powerful. And so I can't stress enough just how important it is to reach out to people who you think won't give you the time of day. But if you're working on something hard, they know what that feels like, and they might give you 15 minutes of their time, and that could be the introduction to the investor that gives you the seed round and so on and so forth. So I've had really good experiences.
Chika, you're stuck right in the middle of it. What are your thoughts? And can we do better?
I mean, you can always do better, right? You can always do better. And I think that there are ways of, again, some of the more structured entities such as government and the, again, incumbents or big industry. A lot of them are starting their own accelerators though, right? Like, you've got Energy Australia, a lot of the retailers, a lot of the other organizations that are there have their own, like they're finding that they need to have these little spin-off groups so that they can work as agilely as possible, and that they can actually start to innovate outside of the bureaucracy of the normal business as usual process. So I think, again, I would just reiterate what I said in terms of now is the time from a lot of different perspectives. One, we've completely run out of time from a climate emergency perspective. Two, there is a lot of support out there. There's a lot of funding. I first started playing in this space in Australia in 2015, 2016, and it is markedly different. And three, I think again, have a go, reach out, network as much as possible. There's a great little podcast called Startup. It started a long time ago, but now they're Gimlet Media, and their first season of this podcast is pretty much what Richard was talking about, like in a nutshell, right? How to do your pitch, and it's great little anecdotes about what that was like. So I would encourage you to check it out because it's amusing, if nothing else. But yeah, I mean, this is the time to get out there and to explore what the opportunities are for entrepreneurs, particularly in energy in Australia.
Alex, you were pretty much a newbie on the startup scene 2 years ago. What are your thoughts?
So I concur with everything that's been said, and I think the startup space is sometimes a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot of in the last 2 years, I don't know whether it's obviously new, but there are a lot of people looking to run startup accelerator programs and take things to market and help people. I make sure, I guess my key thing would be make sure that you know what that market looks like and you know what you're getting yourself into if you want to do a startup program. I guess looking back, I'd say if you're going to go into the startup space, think very carefully before you quit your day job and go into it. It is hard, and yeah, you're forever fundraising, and everything they say is true. And I'd also reiterate that there is a lot of help out there. We've been literally blown away by how much time people are willing to spend supporting you if you are going and doing something different and looking to make a difference. We've had great support along there. So,
Can I just add a word of caution as well? While it is all rose petals and great out there, there are also some people who will come and hang on and try and give you advice for a fee, try and help you raise for a fee. There's people out there who will try and extract some value from that early, very delicate startup. So just be careful as well.
Yeah, I would also concur with that. I met someone at a similar event to this several years ago, and they were talking about taking startups into China for a fee. The guy couldn't speak Chinese, didn't seem to have many connections in China, and I'd done a whole bunch of work in Hong Kong, and he didn't know as much about it as I did. So that was my first warning sign of, wow, there are people out there that are trying to take advantage of this, and it was slightly unexpected, but I think you're completely right. Now, I am going to encourage, I think, Roberto, we're kind of almost on time. We're now going to encourage open mic and questions. So we've got a wealth of knowledge here. I mean, Richard in particular has come out of the university system, has commercialized his own R&D, which is still relatively unusual, I think, in Australia. We've got Alex, who is all things hydrogen and green methanol and fuels that people don't understand and don't even go into pyrolysis, because I had to learn all about that. And then Ruchika's got this really interesting background, which is part government, part private industry, and overlapping into that startup sector. Or just hit us up about any question that you might have about the energy transition. So can I encourage a few questions? And I'll give you my mic.
Hello. I have a question for Richard Parsons. Have you got a forecast of when you can produce these engines into a V8 registered type certificate VA aircraft?
So for us, we're entering into the market in smaller aircraft, so 2 to 4 seat training aircraft in the general aviation space. Even there, the regulatory journey is long. It's not quite as bad as bringing a drug to market, but it can go that way. And for us, if we can get their certified product, meaning we can sell to someone who can install that on their aircraft and not have to do any further testing, that's going to be a 3 to 4 year journey for us. For larger aircraft, commercial airliners, check back in 2035 and I'll give you an answer.
So thank you very much for your insights. Just wondering in terms of the clean and reliable energy. About the batteries. As you know, the batteries contain a lot of heavy metals. So what do you think in the end of the life cycle of these batteries will be 100% reliable and clean to help with emissions? Because now we are in the phase to capture the carbon emissions, but in the bottom of the line, what will happen with these heavy metals? Thank you.
I can, yeah. So it's a great question. I think as we transition to different technologies, all product, both in its composition and manufacture, and then subsequent, it produces waste. It produces, emissions. There are two elements to that question that I'll answer. One is the government is looking at how best to measure the emissions that are produced in the entire value chain or supply chain of product manufacture and then use. So those things, they're definitely both government regulators and standards organizations that are looking at ensuring that that gets measured and then is transparent through the process. We're not there yet because the debate ends up being, what is the best way to measure that? How is it best to quantify that? And then the second part of that is, solar panels, for example. How do you recycle solar panels at the end of their life, and what is their usable? So, but absolutely, that's where entrepreneurs are 100% stepping in and saying, actually, for some solar panels, they might be at the end of their life for a particular consumer or for a utility scale solar farm or something, but they have a secondary life. So there's a secondary market there, or you can crush them down. There's a lot of actual potential commercial pathways for how we can address that. When it comes to like heavy metals, I don't think we have that solved yet, right? This is like the pollution is going to exist in some way, shape, or form, no matter what we do. It's incumbent upon us, again, as entrepreneurs and as problem solvers, to figure out how to minimize the impact of that. So I would say that if you have ideas, that definitely people are willing to listen.
Yeah, I can probably give two thoughts on that. The first one, because I'm working on this right now, and I've just developed a calculator to actually help people evaluate the carbon footprint of buying an EV. Now, it's not very well known, but an EV, when you first buy it, is slightly worse for the planet because of the content in its battery, somewhere around 11 to 12% worse than an ICE vehicle. But because you're not guzzling any gas, and particularly if you're recharging from solar panels, your payback period and when the graphs start to cross is about 2 years in. So if that vehicle is going to last for 10 years, the first 2 years you're in deficit, then you pay that off, and then 8 years you're in benefit. And that's right now. I know from being out at Deakin a couple of years ago, still most of those batteries, and I'm sure Richard's got an even better view on this, were produced with no intent to recycle the content of those batteries. That thinking really has only been around, I would say, 3 or 4 years now. But I know researchers are working really hard because it's hard to get that lithium and whatever out of the ground. It still has a residual value, but it hasn't been designed to be recycled. That's starting now, and there are a lot of people in industry looking at that very thing right now. I reckon the current generations of batteries that are going through are going to be the ones that we will struggle to recycle, but that's not going to happen for very long. Richard, I know you're across battery technologies.
My opinion is it's crazy that every single EV pack is bespoke and that they all can't be pulled apart without destroying the pack. It'd be wonderful if they all had a single standard that could just be automated and pulled apart. I would really like to see more involvement from government to put the emphasis on the companies making this. And I know this is challenging when it's companies all around the world, but at Kite, we're making an effort to look at the entire life cycle of our product. So the motor goes out to the customer, it's installed on the aircraft, it's used for its X number of hours, and it's decommissioned and taken off the aircraft. It then comes back to us for full recycling. We don't want that going out and sitting in landfill. It's good for us because we get to examine the motor and learn from it. We get to recoup some of the cost and the materials. But it's just good practice, I think, for the planet as well, long term. And everyone should be doing that wherever possible.
So I think there's more of that design thinking is starting to come through because people, when they're designing a product now, just like Richard's talking about, they're thinking about that circular economy. I don't think that thinking was here 5 years ago.
I mean, the concept of like, reduce, reuse, recycle, and now there's like 7 of them. And again, circular economy, that's a new term for, I think, most people in business. And so, but it is, again, being integrated quite rapidly and quite rightfully. And so, yeah, I think one more time, watch this space. I think this is exactly how people are actually developing products.
But I think, Australia's got the biggest penetration of solar PV on the planet. I think we're about 30 to 35%, depending on what state. Still in Australia, we're not recycling any of those panels. I first saw technology coming out of Germany about 2 years ago that was doing that. Today, in the paper, it was announced that on the Loyang A site, they're going to start recycling solar panels. So you're bang on the money in terms of your question of, should we be doing this? The answer is yes. Are we doing it? Not quite. But we're going to be getting there very soon.
Can I just another little minor point there is you're exactly right, Richard, when you say, both Richards, when you say that the government needs to do more, because one of the challenges in, like, you can have a solar panel that has maybe 40% of its useful life left, but you can't reuse it because it isn't certified properly, right? And that's a bureaucratic, barrier. And so, because the market for this is still pretty early on in sort of, the mass adoption of some of these technologies, the government and the regulators and the standards, they need to catch up. And one of the biggest challenges with the rate of change that's occurring in technology is the government and the regulation is not keeping pace. They're really struggling with that. I don't know what the answer is to that, but there's massive shift that's going to occur very shortly in those areas.
I'm from India, so maybe I don't know the ecosystem here. But one question to Alex, are we mixing methanol in our petrol and other consumption to reduce the emission? India is doing it large scale. And one to Mr. Richard, when you are making the magnets, can we not make the magnets for electrical motors for small scale industry to reduce the inefficiencies?
Sure. So I can talk a bit about methanol and how it's used sort of globally. So I guess the case study, so it doesn't surprise me that it's used as a gasoline substitute in India. I think China is the one which has sort of doubled down on methanol more than anywhere else. So China has basically got a policy of converting coal into methanol, and they have whole car brands that the Geely car brand does methanol-powered vehicles. You can go and buy a methanol-powered car. All of the municipal buses and trucks and everything all run on methanol. And that's the way that they monetize their coal resource. Again, it's a bit of a regulatory thing. So we don't have any fuel standards in the EU or in the US. You can have up to, I get it around the wrong way, one's 3%, one's 5% methanol. So you can do, that's an automatic potential market for methanol, for example, but we don't have fuel standards. Methanol is not a fuel in Australia, and it's not that companies haven't tried. There's been a huge amount of work done to try and get methanol in as a low carbon gasoline substitute in Australia. It just never got through the regulatory hoops. Yeah.
Second question, Richard?
Yeah, I think if I understood the question correctly, you're asking why aviation first, why not heavy industry for our products, our electric motors?
Large-scale motors are there in all over the world, electric motors. If we can change that magnetic material, instead of like magnetite or whatever we are using, secure material, will the efficiency of reduction of energy will not come down?
Yeah.
The large market, what you are targeting is a niche market.
So the question was, can we help improve efficiencies in all electric motors? And the answer is yes. Today, globally, worldwide, about half of all electricity we produce ends up in an electric motor. And so even single digits, even fraction of a percentage improvements in efficiency has a big impact. When we started developing this technology, Aeroperm, we looked at, there's so many uses for electric motors out there, trying to decide what was the best beachhead market for us, who were those early adopters. And with our technology right now today, the scale we can produce at is quite small. So we talk to Dyson, we talk to Bosch, we talk to Toyota, and they say, this is great, when can you make us 1 million motors? And we can make you 2. And so we then looked at, well, what are the the industries that have a huge need and a big impact, where the volume's a bit lower, but the price point's a bit higher. And we started looking at drones. Drones enabling to fly a lot further, very, very useful, but the business case wasn't there. People are used to paying hundreds of dollars for drone motors, not thousands. And that's how we ended up settling on aviation. With time, as the technology matures, as the economies of scale kick in and we go from tens of kilograms to hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands and beyond, we will spread to the EV market. We will look at consumer goods. It could be used in trains, trucks, buses, industrial motors, everywhere. That's the goal.
Victorian government, as I understand, is doing a lot of things for energy efficiency. Can they not collaborate and then help? I think there are 3 lakhs MSME all over Australia. So whether there can be a collaboration? So what I understand from Mr. Richard is the scaling up of the production facility.
The grants and the sort of scale that I'm aware of for the Victorian government is much more small to medium-sized businesses and residential consumers in terms of energy efficiency practices. ARENA, which is the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, they do a lot of grant funding for sort of larger industrial investment in energy efficiency. But really, I mean, it's a commercial decision for these folks, right? I mean, I'm also, we'll talk afterwards, right? But I mean, yeah, it's I think there, to your point, there are multiple pathways that particular technology could go down. They have to make the decision based on what works for them commercially.
Right. Sorry, we're going to try and. I'm sorry, I'm respectful of you as an individual, but I know there's a lot of people with.
Thanks for that. That was a really interesting presentation. I've got two questions, both related for Richard and Alex, if I may. Starting with Richard, with the aviation space, I imagine with the electric motor, you need a sizable battery on the plane as well. Have you ever thought about, like, for example, in the industry, using alternative fuel, like the way Alex suggested for aviation? And then for Alex, I'm going to flip the script and ask the converse question. It seems like with shipping, you just got a lot more space in a container ship or a bulk carrier, etc., to have batteries, to have bulky batteries on board. Wouldn't electric motors for shipping be more suitable than looking into alternative fuels?
I guess I'll take that one first. Yes, batteries, heavy. Planes can't fly very far because of it, is the short answer. So electric aircraft today, the biggest challenge is very, very limited endurance. So even small electric aircraft, you're flying less than an hour, which isn't going to get you very far. New technology, new batteries, new airframes, new electric motors will all help. And over the coming years, we'll see that stretch to multiple hours. But it's still going to be small electric aircraft. Big aircraft, it's going to be all about alternative fuels, sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen, maybe methanol one day. And that's going to be the status quo, unfortunately, for the foreseeable future for the planes that we all fly on, while the smaller regional aircraft will become electric, I believe.
Yeah, and I guess as a follow-on to that, so it's energy density of batteries. So the amount of energy that's in a fuel tank for a ship, it costs about $12 billion worth of Tesla Powerwall kind of equivalent batteries. I think we calculated the other day. It's just not practical at the moment with the technology that's out there to put batteries in a ship. Yeah.
Can I also just really quickly, I think that there are multiple markets also that we're talking about. There's like what's happening today. There's a transitional market for the next 5 to 10 years where a solution might not make sense long term, but we still need to address it, right? And that's when, I don't like saying this, but that's where when people talk about the energy transition and they talk about the role of gas in that energy transition, it's gas will eventually go away, but it's around for the near term as we start to firm up electricity load, et cetera. So there are transitional technologies that, again, would be incredibly useful as we go from point A to point B. We need like an A.2 or something, right, to get us there.
Can I comment on that? I think that's a really valuable point because we have a big tendency, and this is a massive generalisation, but we have a big tendency, I think, in Australia, and whether it's driven by there's a great idea, it's like, so why don't we just go and put your motors in a plane tomorrow? It's like, let's get after it. It's like, well, you can't do that because of all of the testing and all those kind of things you've got to do. So you can get into, if you cast too far forward and say, yes, but we're going to do this in the future, you never do anything today. That's exactly what you just said. But we get that a lot. So it's like the technology is there today to make green methanol and decarbonise shipping. Why aren't we doing it? It's an open question, and it's like it'll cost more. So are people willing to pay? Everybody says that they are, but the reality is not really. So it's all around market. So there's a lot of great, and it all comes down to market and who's willing to pay is really what it all comes down to. And at the moment, the key thing that's going to make people won't be willing to pay, but what will make them willing to pay is government policy. And that's what's particularly happening in Europe. And that's really the key thing that government is doing. It's going to, and cost of living comes into it as well. It's a massive conundrum. So prices are only going to go up. Everyone wants to do something, but they just don't want to shell out for it, is really. So I sympathise, I don't often say this, but I do sympathise with government, and you've got to trade off those two things. People are going to have to pay more to make a difference. And how do you kind of, decide which horse to back in terms of where you're going to put money and what are you going to make people pay more for?
We've got a question. Hello, David from Silicon Beach here. A question for Richard. It happens that just last month I was at Monash and did a pitch night for researchers there. And great ideas, smart people, but how can we motivate more of them to actually think about commercializing their IP?
I guess the short answer is not all academics are interested or well suited to running a startup. It's a very specific skill set and set of interests that you have to go down. Acknowledging that, making it very clear to academics and people in universities what a startup is and what it isn't is very important. The journey to get there, so the steps that you take, you license, you raise money, and you'll be doing this and you'll be doing that, and giving them the choice. So I view it as there's two different paths for academics to get out of university. You can do as like I did and kind of forge your own path and go meet the investors yourself and really push the whole thing along. Or what's probably more common is you can step aside and say, look, I'm going to stay in the lab and do what I do great, which is support the research, raise the grant funding, and we'll bring in the professional CEO. We'll get the professional CEO to raise the funding and bring the company. And that can also be equally successful. But I feel like most academics haven't even thought about this, let alone understand that there's different routes they can go down. So the more conversations you have there, the better.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I've definitely learned a lot just listening to it. Some of the applications we're talking about here, my background is a consultant and an entrepreneur, but I'm curious to know, has there been any consideration from a defence application? The reason being, we're talking about the engines that have greater, say, flight time, and then we're also talking about alternative fuels from bring to your attention the Defence Strategic Review that came out in the last month. 2% of the national GDP is being pumped into defence expenditure. Have we ever looked at considering any application of that, smaller scale, typically larger dollars that go into it?
Go ahead.
Yep. So yes, we have thought about that. I guess not surprisingly, you can't just go and look up the right people on LinkedIn. So it's a bit difficult, which is probably a good thing in terms of having those conversations. We do bring it up. I guess the feedback we generally get is it is being considered. I think I'd put that in the bucket of when you look at the tenders that have been out recently in terms of the kinds of work that Defence is looking for people to do in terms of alternate fuels. It's clearly not been thought about very much. So I think there's a lot of forming of opinion within government, and I guess I put Defence in that bucket as well, is our take on it. And it will have to sort of crystallise over the next little while about how they're going to kind of address that. But, yeah.
From a speculative perspective, I've had conversations with others in the sector. We've got that nuclear submarine deal that we all know about, and the possibility of developing then the skill set and the sector and extrapolating from that, from a defense perspective, into a renewable source of electricity is definitely something that people are discussing.
Yeah, I would say just to add on that, I think when it comes to green fuels, like Alex is talking about, I think some of the recent discussions that have been had in defence of Australia does need to have its own renewable fuel source. Alex is kind of on that, but it's very hard. In startup communities, defence isn't really talked about very much, although there's a massive pool of money. So if only we had like a submarine in our pocket, we might be able to tap into that. But unfortunately, I don't think anyone here does. So
I'll just mention there is a brand new defence-focused accelerator program at UNSW. I think it's open to everyone countrywide. Might be of interest to anyone here.
Hey, my name is Dev. I just had a question about startups. So I am trying to venture into that kind of space. I'm part of a sustainability program, which is an accelerator program. But what I was trying to understand is, I remember that comment from Alex where you said that don't give up on your day job straight away. But to fund a startup, like the banks look at a steady stream of income coming in. That's when they try to give you a personal loan or a business loan or any of those things. If you don't have a startup idea that is on the government hit list or priority list that, hey, we're going to fund this, we're going to get more people into it, how do you get the funding without bootstrapping yourself and kind of running down your own funds, which could be for personal use or whatever it may be? Like, how do you go out to these angel investors and try to get some funding from them? Like, is there a pattern or is there a way of getting into the market without kind of burning bridges or bootstrapping or any of those things?
So you want to know the secret words you whisper into the ear of the angel to get the checkbook open? I've yet to find those words, unfortunately.
I don't think they exist.
I will say that there's a surprising number of high net worths floating around Australia that you start to bump into when you have conversations with lots of people in the startup world. So if you want to, if you've got a great idea and you're starting to talk to customers and you're building that story around your product and your market and the technology, whatever it may be, talk to other founders and they will open the doors to the investors. And only once you build a reputation in the community that you're a switched on, hustling individual, will people start to take you seriously. If you're a no one, to cold email someone, it doesn't work, unfortunately.
Yeah, just so I guess everyone, or many people, let's do the startup thing, watch the Y Combinator videos on YouTube. Don't work like that. You don't sit in the room and people just write your checks at the end. That's not my experience of it. I don't think that's how it works in Australia. I echo that, is you've got to have, people are looking for people that have or I guess looking at it, why would someone choose you? So what is it that you kind of bring and what will people invest in? And I guess in our personal thing, it's around, we're doing what we spent 20 years doing, which is building large chemical plants. And so people can kind of get that and go, okay, well, yep, they did that for a big company, kind of, I get that. You know, Richard's in that space. What did you do? I did a PhD in, magnetic technology. It's like you can kind of see that and see that investment piece. So I think that's really the genesis of that whole quit the day job thing. It's like, it's actually probably your day job that's going to mean that you go on and you identify something which is worth pursuing a startup, is kind of what I've observed. But it might be different things out there, Dev, but yeah.
So 3 points. One is, if you don't quit your day job, you have to be very careful about how your IP is viewed. When I was working for Exxon, they pretty much owned my brain. And so you do have to be a little bit careful about that. Number two is, if you're not sort of willing to bootstrap, I think you have to kind of question, like I've started down the entrepreneurial journey so many times and I have not had the guts to give up a cushy salary in order to take the risk that these gentlemen have taken. And I think that speaks to then my personality and whether or not I'm suited to that particular, career path in a lot of ways. And then third, I think you're starting to get feedback if the government and market and some others, if you start to hear from them that the idea isn't gelling, you need to work on your pitch or consider pivoting your value proposition towards something that has more value to a particular market base. it might actually be a really good idea, right? It might actually be something that has a tremendous amount of perceived value from if I could just get this in the market. But if you can't make that pitch successfully to people, then it won't go anywhere. And just extending on that, and then I hand it back to Alex, is that I don't know a single startup that hasn't had to pivot what it actually is that they're selling in order to drive their cash flow numerous times. So you're going to start with a product, and you're going to end up selling a product that doesn't necessarily look like that initial idea.
Just one final small point from me. I would say any angel in particular that you would sit down with, and possibly any VC, if they don't see you spending your money alongside theirs, they're not going to be very interested, right? Because that's your skin in the game. So there has to be a judgment call that you make about saying, how much am I going to put in myself and how much can I demonstrate? Because it's very easy to spend someone else's money. We're all very good at that. It's much more difficult to spend your own. And I'm sorry, we do have chance for one more question before we then have to hand over to Roberto again. But I think we will be staying around and can take individual questions.
Thank you for taking the time to speak. So I come from the US electric car industry, and a question to Richard actually is, when developing electric propulsion, there's a lot of specialty in like magnetic design, power electronics, thermals. Like, is the Australian education system actually producing the quality of engineers to feed into that endeavour?
Yes. To elaborate, 100% yes. We have fantastic engineers coming out of our universities. If you look at RMIT, Monash, Melbourne, they've all got these student teams that are churning out electric race cars that are winning world titles. They're building inverters from scratch, electric motors in collaboration with local commercial partners. Very switched on people, as good as you're going to find anywhere else in the world. And I'm not sure. I think we do sometimes get the idea that in Australia, we're this little country compared to these big international countries, and we can't do things. We can definitely do things as well, and we should be proud of that.
Okay, we're going to have to call the Q&A to a halt, but thank you very much for everyone for the questions. And I'm just going to hand briefly back over to Roberto to bring things to a close.